Every other god on this channel rules through strength, beauty, or fear. Hephaestus ruled through skill alone, and he built that skill after being thrown off Olympus twice by both of his own parents. He forged Zeus's Thunderbolt. He built the golden halls of Olympus itself. He shaped the first woman in Greek mythology out of clay, and when his own mother rejected him for how he looked, he got his revenge with a chair. This is the god every other Olympian secretly depended on, the one popular retellings usually reduced to a punchline, despite the fact that nearly every iconic weapon, throne, and structure in this mythology has his fingerprints on it somewhere. Ancient sources genuinely disagree about how Hephaestus was born. Some say he was the ordinary son of Zeus and Hera. Others, including Hesiod, say Hera bore him entirely on her own, without Zeus, a direct mirror of Zeus, later producing Athena alone from his own head, a story this channel already told from Athena's side. Either way, the result was the same. Hephaestus was born with a physical difference, often described as lame or malformed in the legs, and Hera, disgusted by his appearance, threw him from Olympus into the sea below. He fell for a full day and night before landing in the ocean, where the sea goddesses Thetis and Eurynome found him and raised him in secret for 9 years, hidden inside an underwater cave, entirely unknown to the rest of Olympus. It's during these 9 hidden years that he first learns metalwork, crafting jewelry and ornaments for the 2 goddesses raising him, meaning his entire foundational skill set was built in secret, completely disconnected from Olympus before he'd ever set foot there as an adult. Hephaestus eventually returns to Olympus, and in one version of the myth is thrown a second time by Zeus himself during a violent argument with Hera for taking his mother's side. This second fall is the one credited with permanently damaging his legs. He crashes onto the island of Lemnos, which becomes his sacred territory and cult center for the rest of antiquity. 2 separate falls, 2 separate parents, and by most tellings, the injury that defines the rest of his life happens on the second one, inflicted not by an accident, but by a father punishing him for loyalty to the mother who'd already rejected him once. The god of fire and the forge spends the rest of his mythology visibly, permanently marked by an act of parental violence in a pantheon that otherwise tends to let its gods heal from almost anything. Before we get to exactly how Hephaestus made his own parents pay for that, hit subscribe now so you don't miss it. Hephaestus didn't simply accept his exile. Years later, he sent Hera a gift, an exquisite golden throne. The moment she sat in it, invisible mechanical restraints locked around her, trapping her in place with no release mechanism any other god could find. Hephaestus refused to come fix it and refused every messenger sent to convince him. It took Dionysus getting him thoroughly drunk and coaxing him back to Olympus on a mule to finally get Hephaestus to release his own mother. It's one of the strangest stories in the entire pantheon, a god using pure engineering, not violence or magic, to hold the queen of the gods hostage until he got an apology. Some later sources add that he only agreed to return in exchange for a second wife promised to him directly by Zeus, a detail that, depending on the version, is either Aphrodite herself or the grace goddess Aglaea, meaning even Hephaestus's marriage may have started as a negotiated ransom rather than a simple arrangement. What actually earned Hephaestus his place among the Olympians in the end wasn't strength or cunning, it was output. Working alongside the Cyclopes, he forged Zeus's signature Thunderbolt, the weapon that defines Zeus in nearly every myth this channel has already told. He forged Achilles' legendary armor at his mother Thetis's request, described by Homer in exhaustive detail, shield included, with the shield's surface said to depict entire scenes of ordinary human life, war, farming, weddings, and the stars themselves, hammered into bronze. And according to Hesiod, at Zeus's direct command, he shaped Pandora, the first woman in this mythology, out of clay, given life and sent to Earth as a punishment disguised as a gift. Every one of these objects and figures shows up in someone else's most famous story. Hephaestus built the props for a mythology he rarely gets to star in himself. He's also credited with building golden automaton attendants to assist him in his own forge. Mechanical servants described as capable of independent movement and even speech, functioning essentially as living tools built by a god whose own body had been permanently damaged by the people who were supposed to care for him. Hephaestus's engineering wasn't limited to weapons and jewelry. According to later sources, he built Talos, a giant bronze automaton, and gave him to King Minos of Crete to guard the island's shores. Talos ran the coastline 3 times a day, hurling boulders at approaching ships and scorching pirates against his own superheated bronze body. His one weakness was a single vein of divine ichor sealed by a bronze pin at his ankle. When the sorceress Medea helped the Argonauts get past him, she either tricked him into removing the pin himself or worked a curse that loosened it, and Talos bled out and collapsed, the only giant in Greek mythology ever built rather than born, and killed by exactly the kind of technical flaw only its own maker would think to design around. The image stuck. Ancient vase painters kept returning to the scene of his collapse for centuries after the story was first told, and the idea of a self-moving bronze guardian, built by a god of craft rather than granted life by nature, reads today like one of the oldest surviving blueprints for the idea of a robot anywhere in Western storytelling. This channel already covered this marriage from Aphrodite's own side, so here's the piece that belongs to Hephaestus specifically. Catching her and Ares required real cleverness, not brute force. He forged chains so fine they were effectively invisible, rigged them with a hidden trigger above his own bed, and waited. When he sprang the trap and summoned the other gods to witness it, he wasn't simply humiliated. He was, for one brief moment, the smartest person in the room, using the exact skill everyone underestimated him for, to publicly outmaneuver the god of war himself. Hephaestus once pursued Athena, and by most ancient accounts she firmly refused him. During the struggle, his advance failed to land, and what fell instead struck the earth itself. From that contact, the earth goddess Gaia conceived and bore a child, Erichthonius, a boy born half-serpent, who Athena chose to raise anyway, despite wanting no part in fathering him. She hid him in a sealed basket and gave it to the daughters of the Athenian king Cecrops, warning them never to look inside. 2 of them opened it out of curiosity, saw the serpent child, and were driven mad with fear. Erichthonius grew up to become a king of Athens himself, credited with inventing the 4-horse chariot, a strange, indirect legacy for a son Hephaestus never actually raised. When Zeus suffered from a splitting, unbearable headache after swallowing the Titaness Metis, it was Hephaestus who split his skull open with an axe to relieve it, and Athena emerged fully grown and fully armored, a moment already covered in her own episode from her side of the story. From Hephaestus's side, it's a different kind of scene entirely. The god everyone treats as merely a toolmaker is the one whose specific skill with a blade literally brings one of the most important Olympians into existence. Hephaestus's daughter by marriage, Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, married the mortal hero Cadmus, founder of Thebes, and Hephaestus gave her a wedding gift, a golden necklace of extraordinary beauty. Some ancient sources say he built it laced with a curse, a lasting punishment aimed at Aphrodite for her affair with Ares, channeled through the daughter that affair's aftermath had produced. Whatever the exact motive, the necklace brought ruin to nearly everyone who wore it across generations, tangled up in the later tragedies of the Theban royal line still told in the plays of Sophocles. A wedding gift from the god of the forge turned out to be one of the most quietly destructive objects in the entire mythology. Modern media loves reducing Hephaestus to comic relief, the ugly, bumbling smith god, present mostly for a laugh at his own expense. Ancient sources don't support that flattening nearly as much as popular culture assumes. Homer treats him with genuine warmth, describing his skill with open admiration and giving him some of the more sympathetic dialogue of any god in the Iliad. He's rejected twice by his own parents for how he looks, builds an entire career and reputation anyway, and ends up essential to nearly every other god's most famous story. That's a different arc than comic relief. It's closer to the one figure in this entire pantheon who succeeds specifically because of what everyone else dismissed him for. Compare his path to nearly every other Olympian in this pantheon. Zeus rules through inherited authority, Ares through raw force, Apollo through natural talent handed to him at birth. Hephaestus is the only major god whose entire reputation was built through visible, repeated effort after starting from active rejection rather than any advantage at all. Homer's Iliad gives us the forge scenes and the making of Achilles' armor in extraordinary technical detail. Hesiod's Theogony gives us Pandora's creation and the broader outline of his birth and exile. The Homeric hymn to Hephaestus praises him directly for teaching humanity metalworking and civilized crafts, crediting him alongside Athena for lifting people out of a rougher, cave-dwelling existence. Later sources, including the mythographer Apollodorus, fill in the darker threads. Talos, Erichthonius, and the Cursed Necklace all come down to us through these later compilations rather than Homer or Hesiod directly, evidence of just how much material had already built up around him by the time later writers started collecting it. Athens itself kept his memory alive through direct worship, not just poetry. The Hephaestia, an annual Athenian festival held in his honor alongside Athena, featured torch races through the city streets, runners passing a lit flame hand to hand toward a finish line. A public ritual built entirely around the god whose defining element was fire itself. On Lemnos, local tradition also gave him sons, known as the Kabiri, minor smith deities tied to their own separate mystery cult on the island. Further proof that Hephaestus's cult presence extended well beyond the handful of stories that made it into Homer and Hesiod. Hephaestus's legacy sits underneath nearly everything else on this channel without most viewers ever noticing it. He built the halls of Olympus, the weapon that defines Zeus, the armor that defines Achilles, and the first woman in Greek mythology. The Romans worshipped him as Vulcan and associated volcanic activity directly with his forge, believing eruptions on islands like Lemnos and Sicily were literally the sound of him at work underground, a belief that gave us the modern word, volcano itself. He survives today as the patron figure behind every fictional blacksmith, inventor, and craftsman who builds the tools other flashier characters get credit for using. Modern retellings that lean into a more sympathetic, disabled hero reading of him aren't actually inventing something new. They're arguably closer to how Homer originally wrote him than the punchline version popular culture more often reaches for instead. Next, the goddess whose grief once stopped the entire harvest of the world, Demeter, and the story we've only ever told from her daughter's side of it. Subscribe so you don't miss it.